Narrow halls, dark rooms, the foggy outdoors. It's moments like these in horror where we see what's going on, and yet we don't. Our anxiety builds up knowing that a potential threat is nearby, yet we can't see it. At times, it becomes unbearable, and we beg for the director to just rip that band-aid off with a jump scare. In this video, we'll explore the different ways horror films limit what we see and how they're used effectively in the build-up of a jump scare. A jump scare can be broken into three parts: the downtime, the build-up, and the scare itself. A movie will loop through these, often going back and forth between the build-up and the jump scare before we finally get a chance to breathe again. And contrary to popular belief, it is the build-up that is the scariest. Alfred Hitchcock said it best: there is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. What separates the good jump scares from the bad ones is the quality of the build-up. A jump scare that comes too quickly will only startle you, but one that really takes its time to get under your skin will leave you with fear. We've linked some videos in the description that break down jump scares further than we will in this video, since our focus will be on what we believe to be the best way to build one up by limiting our view. But first, we need to go over an important concept of how and why this is done. The less information you have on a situation, the scarier it is. This is why in horror we're often more scared before the first time we've seen the threat. Think of A Quiet Place, The Descent, or even Jaws, where they didn't show the shark until much later to make its reveal even scarier. The best example of this fear of the unknown is in the video game Subnautica. This game feels much less scary when playing it a second time around, after you've already seen all of the creatures. Since movies are mostly a visual form of media, the concept of the safe space is the area on the screen we can see. This area is often shared between us and the character in the situation, usually the victim or someone vulnerable. It is when we're put in the character's shoes, which can be done with a first-person point of view shot or a camera following the character. But it is when this safe space becomes severely limited where we and the character are anxious to get a better grasp of the situation. Couple this with other typical horror cues that hint at a nearby threat, and it's game over. Manipulating this space is done by using lighting, obstacles, and the camera. It is important to note that having no safe space isn't effective at all. You need to have a bit of info to know what's going on to make the dangerous areas relatively more dangerous, and enough to actually see the jump scare or whatever the buildup is leading to. So let's take a look at some of the best ways horror films do this. Lighting, or I guess the lack of lighting, can be an easy way to reduce what we see on screen. This may be pretty obvious, as it's why most horror films are in the dark. The fear of the dark can be linked to the fear of the unknown, the fear of what can be lurking in the darkness. Through darkness, a majority of the screen can quickly be made unsafe for you and the character, but some light source is still needed to tease us with information, whether we want it or not. A great example of this is in The Conjuring. No, not the wardrobe scene where there is an odd amount of light coming from that one lamp, though this scene is a great example of misdirection, another form of buildup. We wanted to take a look at the basement scene early in the film, where it has three good uses of darkness, each time limiting our safe space even more until we are greeted with that final jump scare. We'll start with the moment the basement doors open by themselves. The rest of the house is fairly lit at this point, except the newly opened doors that are pitch black. We don't know what's in the area of the screen, but we assume the threat is there due to the previous hints. As the character gets closer to the door, more of our screen becomes black. We expect the threat to appear when we're at our most vulnerable, but the scene continues. Fast forward a bit, the woman is now in a dimly lit basement with lots of darkness near and around the furniture. We'll actually talk about this part of the scene a bit later. The smallest our safe space gets is when the light bulb explodes, making the basement pitch black until she lights a match. In some of these shots, over 2/3 of the screen is pitch black, even losing all light at one point when she has to relight a new match. During this time, we lose all information on her surroundings and fully expect to see the threat when the next match is lit. But once again, the scene continues. Alfred Hitchcock once said, "Always make the audience suffer as much as possible." Well, this part of the scene with the match was held for over 20 seconds. After this, the final jump scare is delivered, and it was definitely well earned. The movie Alien also limited our view very well during the airshaft scene closer to the end of the film. For starters, we're in a very narrow, multi-level airshaft, and we know the threat is closing in, but we don't know at what level. The air shafts are long and dark, so Dallas is using a flamethrower to provide some kind of information ahead of making contact with the alien. Due to the nature of the setting, our safe space lasts a few seconds after each burst of the flamethrower, as we know the alien wouldn't be able to cross the shaft within that moment. I also love this example as its light source is also a weapon. This makes us feel even safer every time he pulls the trigger, not just from the information we get of his surroundings, but that it would also fight off the threat. Let's talk about yet another movie. Although kind of dumb in logic, the camera flash scene from Mama also deals with our safe zone existing within certain time periods. Except unlike the alien airshaft scene, the camera flashes only make the threat even more threatening, contradicting the idea that information equals safety. The short film Lights Out flips the idea of darkness, limiting our view upside down. In this odd case, it is actually in the darkness where we have the most information of the threat. But let's get back to traditional uses of lighting in horror. How about a film where what we see is constantly limited by darkness? Well, that's pretty much what The Descent is. This movie follows a group of women that get stuck in a deep cave that has other inhabitants while exploring it. The entire film's lighting is limited to flashlights, glow sticks, flares, a lighter, and a camera's night vision mode. As you'd expect, the film manipulates our safe space throughout its whole runtime to the point we never truly feel safe. In this short scene where the group makes first contact with the creatures, we see a number of light sources our safe space latches onto. We as the audience already know of the threat, so some of the earlier shots with the lighter and camera build up our anxiety and not the characters, which culminates in the film's best jump scare. In each section of this video, we'll also go over a video game example of how our safe space is limited within them. The Forest is pretty close to being a game adaptation of The Descent, except it takes place both outside and within the caves. Our fear when we're outside during the day compared to when we're in the caves is substantially different due to the effect lighting has on our safe space. Phasmophobia also tackles lighting and our desire for information extremely well. We use all the equipment at our disposal to find the location of the ghost and what its strengths and weaknesses are. But what is your most important piece of equipment? Your flashlight. And somehow, using a flashlight is scarier than not using one at all. And this goes back to the idea that we need to have a bit of info to make everything outside the light that much scarier. We need the light for something to appear in the light, as bad as that sounds. Although our screens are flat, our safe space is actually a three-dimensional area. So let's talk about how horror films manipulate the depth of it. If our safe space is shared with the character, then it makes sense that there'd be depth to it. Manipulating the depth is done through the use of objects or the environment. It is anything that would hinder our vision or something after a certain distance. So technically, lighting also affects it in that regard, as a light source provides light in 3 dimensions and there's a fall off to light in every direction. But the most common way to reduce the depth of our safe space is by using objects. Objects can block the vision of you and the character, allowing something to lurk behind it. Let's get back to the Conjuring basement scene where the light bulb is still intact. Look at how crowded that basement is with old furniture. We as the audience know the threat is here, and the character suspects something as well. But look at how much our depth is restricted. Other than this one area with the cabinets, the rest is free territory for the threat to hide behind. The camera sits on these items for quite some time, making us feel anxious as we wait for the threat to appear from behind any one of those objects. Another good example is the sound studio scene from Scream 2, which also limits our view's depth with objects. Here we see Gale hiding from Ghostface by using the soundproof walls. The layout of these walls constantly throws off our depth, and we are unsure where Ghostface would appear from next. Couple this with the soundproofing where both Gale and Ghostface can't hear each other, and we are given one of the best horror chase sequences. What makes us most anxious in this scene though is that Gale herself is severely limiting her view in each of these 3 positions in a situation where vision is all you can rely on. Although usually a quick thinker, I think this is one of her luckier moments. Depth can also be limited by how you film the scene. Filming with a shallow depth of field is a common technique to get the audience to focus on what's important in a scene. This is tougher in horror films because blurred backgrounds make us feel a bit at ease since we know the director is trying to have us focus on something else. But it's still possible to pull it off, like the librarian scene from It. But a majority of the audiences missed it on their first viewing. If you want the audience to notice, a slow fade into focus is a great way to get a scare. But my favorite way our view's depth is reduced is by the environment or setting itself. Somehow these situations feel a bit more relatable, and the anxiety that's built up from them is there for most of the runtime because it's hard to escape the setting. A good and bad example of this is Nope. Nope's threat was unique compared to other films these days, but its safe space was even more unique. The threat uses the clouds to hide, so everything below it we have information on. Although I enjoyed the film, it wasn't too scary due to how safe we as the audience felt. Most of the film was during the day, so it was extremely tough to build up a proper jump scare as we'd be able to see the threat from a mile away. It probably had the largest visual safe space of any horror film, as it was that whole valley, though I still feel a bit weird looking at clouds ever since. This Letterboxd user said it best: this movie does for cloud spotting what Jaws did for swimming. And speaking of Jaws, it might be the best film example of using the environment to reduce our visual depth. There are many scares that support this idea, and they can be split into two groups: above water and underwater. Because it takes place on such a large body of water, the shark in the film can really be anywhere in it. The problem is, it's difficult to see the shark unless it's very close due to the reflection of the surface. We think our safe space is huge, but it's relatively tiny with how deep and large the area of water is. This personally gave me a bit of anxiety during any scene where they're just looking at the water, and I don't even have thalassophobia, which is the fear of large bodies of water. I actually find the scenes where we can see the shark to be less scary as we have information on its whereabouts. So what about underwater? Well, it's much scarier, of course. Aside from the fact that you're in the shark's territory, our vision becomes even more limited. It is much more difficult for light to travel in water, causing our depth to be reduced. This cage scene from Jaws shows it best. Look at how easily the diver loses the shark as it went a certain distance away. The diver is also suspended in a cage where he's got every direction around him for the shark to appear from. This water extends thousands of miles in certain directions, so this is relatively the smallest safe space we've covered so far. So how do you make this even scarier? By doing it at night. Now in this scene, we're dealing with both darkness and the limited depth we can see in water. The shark wasn't even in the scene, but with how little we could see, it could have been swimming very close by. I think it's pretty clear what game we'd use as an example here: Subnautica. Subnautica is a survival game that takes place mostly underwater on an alien planet full of violent creatures. The game gives us all the same restrictions to our view that we covered with Jaws. When above the surface, it's difficult to see what's nearby in the water. When in the water, the distance we can see falls off pretty quickly. And the game includes a day and night cycle to make things even scarier. But where this game pushes us to our limits is that to progress through the game, you need to keep reaching deeper and deeper parts of the ocean. Our safe space continues to shrink as we get deeper due to how little light reaches those depths. Playing the game, I had to constantly build up the courage to go deeper and face the unknown that lurks there, somehow feeling smaller the deeper I went. But sometimes our whole view is our safe space, yet we still feel threatened. Let's check out how that works. Often in horror, we can clearly see everything on the screen, but what we see doesn't capture the entire situation. This is done by using the camera to limit ours and the character's frame of reference. In these situations, the entire screen is our safe space, but we know or suspect our threat to be somewhere close by, yet off screen. This is one of the best ways horror limits what we see, as we don't know the scope of our surroundings and have no idea how big our safe space is relative to everything else. Our safe space doesn't even feel safe anymore, as any understanding of the situation we had is lost. This is often done by using the character's point of view. In film, this is usually when the character is looking through something like a keyhole, slits of a bathroom stall, or a closet door. Although these are quite effective, there is one way of showing the character's point of view that triumphs over the others: a camera. A camera that the character uses, not the one they used to make the film, although it's the same one in this case. Found footage horror films are an example of this, like the Blair Witch Project and Wreck. Here we see what the character sees as they use the camera throughout the entire film. But what we see is even more limited, as the cameras used often have a narrow field of view. Think about how much less scary these films would have been if they used an iPhone's ultra-wide lens. Both these movies build up our anxiety throughout their entire runtimes, as the camera becomes shakier and we see less and less of what's actually going on. Our frame of reference is thrown off and hard to stabilize to get a better grasp of the situation. The more danger the characters are in, the less information we have. Using the camera to allow both the character and us to see something we wouldn't otherwise be able to see is the scariest use of this. Turning on the night vision mode in a dark scene is a common way of doing it. Going back to The Descent, the character is using the camera to help her see in the dark. But it's the narrow field of view of the camera that provides the build up for the jump scare as she checks on each character around her until we finally see the threat. Our frame of reference is so limited that the creature could have been standing there for 30 seconds prior to its reveal. And it's these kind of moments that get under our skin. Wreck also has a night vision scene at the end, but it's not used to build up a jump scare and instead allows us and the character to see the threat for the entire scene. But Rec does have a great scene right before this one that leads into the best jump scare of the movie. With the camera's lights still intact, the cameraman sticks his camera up into an attic door that has been revealed to them in the dark. What then occurs is my favorite scene that manipulates our safe space's frame of reference. The camera is slowly rotated 360 degrees to see what is in the attic. We slowly shift our field of view until finally being greeted with a jump scare at the last possible moment, making us, the audience, suffer as much as possible. The eeriest part of the scene is that the boy was next to the camera the whole time. Before moving away from the use of cameras, I wanted to go over a video game example. And rather than looking at games where we use handheld night vision cameras such as Outlast and the Blair Witch Project game, I wanted to look at a different way of using them. In Five Nights at Freddy's, you play as an overnight security guard that looks after a family restaurant full of haunted animatronics. You use the security camera system to track the animatronics' movements as they try to make their way into your security room. There are over 10 cameras that watch over the rooms and halls. The problem is that you can only look through one camera at a time. Anything outside of our frame of reference is vulnerable to our threat's movements. To make matters worse, looking through cameras uses up the building's power, so you need to be efficient with which cameras to look at to give you a good understanding of the entire situation. We mentioned limiting your frame of reference is often done using first-person POV shots, but it can also be done in the third person. In this scene from Psycho, the camera is close in front of the detective. At the start of the scene, we see him take a look at all the closed doors, but during his walk upstairs, we the audience are shown a close-up of one of the doors opening. But because of the way the camera stays on the detective, no doors are in our frame of reference, making us feel extremely vulnerable from every direction. The first time we see an open door, it's already too late. And then this scene from The Shining where Danny bikes around the hotel also does this well. The music and eerie camera movement following Danny hints towards some paranormal reveal. When the camera is following Danny in the narrow halls, our safe space is only the remainder of the hall in front of him. The moment he turns the corner, we are greeted with a threat that's been hinted at. One other way to manipulate the safe space's frame of reference and quickly give a glimpse to what's outside is by using a mirror. Mirror scares in horror are infamously known for being cheap and overused, but when used properly, they can be quite memorable. Mirrors allow you to see what is at the opposite angle of how you view them. By a character simply closing a mirrored door, our frame of reference will be altered. They can give that same eerie vibe that the Rec Attic Boy gave, that the threat was behind the character the whole time. But my favorite example of this might be the origin of this type of scare, and it's from the film Repulsion. In this scene, the threat's reflection appears halfway through closing the door. Every other angle that the door is in has the threat outside our frame of reference. Mirrors are usually used for the scare itself, rather than the buildup. I just thought it'd be worth going over them. But this mirror scene from us is used as a buildup. The mirrors are used to confuse us with what our frame of reference actually is. And at this moment, the scene has us in its grips. So I think that covers the many different ways that horror films limit what we see and how they are used in the buildup of a jump scare. I'm sure there are many more great scenes out there that fall into these 3 ways of limiting your safe space. If you know of any, make sure to leave a comment below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe. And until next time, have a good one.